Hello, everyone. It's great to see everybody attending here. Today's talk, of course, the artist talk by Amy Modahl. My name is Craig Willms, the assistant curator at the Kamloops Art Gallery, where I curate the Cube project space, encouraging new works and new projects in our little, exactly as it sounds, Cube Gallery. The Kamloops Art Gallery is situated on the unceded territory of the Kamloops te Secwepemc within Secwepemc, the ancestral lands of the Secwepemc people. All of this land that we refer to as Kamloops and beyond, spanning over 180,000 square kilometers across the interior plateau of BC, is Secwepemc. It is an immense privilege to be a guest on this land. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Amy Modahl. Amy is based in Salmon Arm, BC. Her practice includes painting, drawing, stop motion animation, and performance. She's exhibited in solo and group exhibitions in Kelowna at the Kelowna Art Gallery and Alternator, in Calgary at Stride and Wallace Galleries, the Vernon Public Art Gallery, Sioux Visual Arts Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, of note, and others. She has an interdisciplinary Master's of Fine Arts in Visual Art from the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus, a Master's in Applied Linguistics from Northern Arizona University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Fine Art, Art History, and Spanish from St. Cloud State, also in Minnesota. This show, How Have You Been, is on right now in the Cube. The last day is this Saturday, September 25th. So if you haven't had the opportunity to see the show, please get down there in the next couple of days. Our program today is probably around 45 minutes to an hour. You can submit questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find down below, or through the chat, and you can also chat amongst yourselves. There's two options in the chat for panelists or for everyone. You can find those down below, and feel free to put your comments during the talk. At the end, we'll go through questions and take it from there. Amy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's all yours.
Thank you for having me from home in Salmon Arm, and thanks everyone for joining, and especially thanks Craig and Emily for organizing this talk, and Craig for inviting me to show in the Cube and be part of the Kamloops art community. I really appreciate that. So here is Craig and I at our opening, which was very limited in attendance. We had, you know, of course, because of the BC regulations, could invite, what was it, 4 or 6 people, and there were a lot of constraints on what we could do, but there we are in the Cube. So that was an exciting night. That was like one of my first, that was like my only night out in a year. So thanks a lot again. Now I have some notes here. I've organized the talk, so sometimes I'll look down and then look over and coordinate the slides. So that's what you'll see me doing. So here's a view of the final installation, just one view of it, and I'll show other slides, both close up and other images. And a lot of those images were taken by the Kamloops Art Gallery, others by myself or my partner, Harold Nix. So here's a view of the final installation, but I'll begin this talk before its inception. Craig contacted me back in the summer of 2019, kind of like another world now. And we talked about potentially showing some of my gestural 2-dimensional paintings. But as the pandemic struck, it seemed the project for the Cube would really need to be more responsive to the mood and challenges of the time. So my first concern was how to make the work meaningful. So I started reflecting on prior research in nonverbal communication and began contemplating how necessary pandemic social distancing, you know, that keeping apart, was affecting people deeply, because unconscious patterns of behavior those that make moving through a space and interacting with others feel comfortable were suddenly so changed. So it seemed that everyone was in a constant state of sustained discomfort. As a result, I started to reimagine the cube, so named, as Craig mentioned, for its small box-like shape. I reimagined it molded into a reprieve, an antidote to that discomfort. So in searching for a way to achieve this goal, I settled on a version of a 2018 installation from Salmon Arm Art Gallery. That painting on butcher paper hung above the entry, lit from behind, and invited people into the gallery. And the response was that it was warm and inviting, and it was really kind of the comforting tone that I wanted for the cube. My next concern was if the whole work and the space were designed to kind of connect with people, to comfort, what would be on the work. So this seminar piece that you can see here had hand gestures derived largely from politicians and then my imagination, and then they were abstracted. But these really didn't seem meaningful for what we need now. So I thought about words, but like words from what? From the news, from pandemic guidelines. These all seem too sterile and really not appropriate for the tone I wanted to create. So later I came up with the solution of letters. I wanted to hear from personal experience about emotional reactions. So Craig and I talked about this. I think there was some mention from Craig about, would this be a Dear Abby thing, and a bit of a joke. And I was like, oh yeah, I really don't want it to be a Dear Abby situation. But I do want to hear from people and their experiences, but I'm not necessarily writing back with advice. And so we talked about a method for the KEG, the Kamloops Art Gallery, and their public library, Thompson Rivers, I think it's called Public Library, to send out a call to the Kamloops art community. And I think the library even had a bit of a workshop. And the main question people were asked was, how have you been? Which is relatively open, but we have this shared experience of the pandemic. So largely the answers related to the pandemic. I waited, I worried, but answers eventually came in via email and written letter, all in English with Roman alphabets, except this one that I had to put up here from an 8th grader at Kamloops School of the Arts. It was all in her own code, and she had a little bit of a key. And so I was able to decode the whole thing, which I really enjoyed. So I was so thankful there were so many replies. The people who wrote ranged in age from those 8th graders to people over 80 years old. They were from the US, Eastern Canada, mostly Western Canada, and mostly from the Kamloops area. As I read the letters, I found a pattern across them that was like an experience of loss leading to something found. A measure of personal introspection. So some people suffered more greatly from loss, from economic disparity, or other challenges. Others were feeling safe in their rural homes with good jobs. So there was a lot of variety in that, except for this consistency of sort of something lost, something gained. And I also, learned a lot about people's, lives and their daily lives, things like being able to see grandchildren or being away from grandchildren, about being isolated at home with one's parents, especially when young, and how that might create particular challenges, especially if you're a teenager. These recollections all became interwoven into the work. And I'm sure many of you have read snippets of handwriting, of course, from friends' letters or relatives' letters, but maybe from historic documents, especially separated by time. Those kinds of correspondence, like for example, from artists or writers, can show us like how not only the words they write, but something about their voice we see something about their emotion or their time or the place that they come from in the manner in which they write, the way they form their letters. So we get to reading beyond the words themselves, something that is like tone of voice or hand gesture, but in the word. So if we go back to, I received these letters. My next concern was really about what media and color would be meaningful for the content. Initially, I'd prepared to rewrite their words with just black ink on transfer paper. And I thought the black would reflect ink in a letter and be meaningful in that way. And the transfer paper would be semi-opaque and allow for sort of a glowing from behind between the black letters and create the warmth of the space. But as I read the letters and really saw that feeling in the way people write, I began to choose color and vary media in response to those tones in the letters. And that resulted in a process that was more responsive, more spontaneous, and much more varied. I chose to mostly write in cursive, interpolating many of the letters from email form. As I worked, I thought about the contrast in handwriting versus mechanical type. So this was a new thing that really emerged for me as I worked. And I thought about how the way the form of the words conveys different meaning, like I was talking about with historical letters. Typewritten words have this kind of visual uniformity, whereas handwriting is individualistic and reveals that emotion and expression of the writer. And at the same time, I had spent the year steeped in reading digital papers, digital articles, digital books, everything as faculty of Okanagan College, and really not much having much human contact. So these papers from Okanagan College, for example, and their words, the way they look, intentionally communicate is very professional, very distanced. It has an intentionally impersonal tone. So this cube project became a kind of catharsis, not only from pandemic stress, but from a year of reading that distancing text via computer. And it made me think more about this contrast in writing by the hand and writing mechanically. So I've always loved handwriting for how it not only shows emotional state and is a mark of individual expression, as I mentioned before, but also for how handwriting frees my own mind. I often write in the studio, filling countless books with whatever is rolling through my head when I enter. It's just like nonsense. I call it like gobbledygook of the day or mental muck pouring out onto the page. And as I write, really, my hand and mind become looser. Like I start losing those things that are winding through my mind that are really unproductive and start getting into the mode of thinking with my hands, which I need to do in the studio. So I can enter a sort of almost, can I call it meditative state? I don't know a lot about meditations, that might be a stretch, but it's where I notice kind of nothing outside the page, the pen and ink, and my hand moving. And it's really relaxing. So because of that, as I rewrote words from the letters onto these this long rolls of transfer paper, I ended up layering in that feeling, that emotional and physical response of my own. And it was very relaxing, and increasingly my brush would flow, my arm like moved, and I felt like I really got into the piece as it moved along. And the scale of each gesture started to get bigger at times, and so on. So I'll talk more about some of those things. But before I get there, another question, really, I had these particular questions that were really needed to be solved. Like I wanted to work big, but I don't have a lot of space. I have a very tiny studio. So my question was, how could I manage to work large in a very small space? And also, I wanted to work from above. So I solved this by setting up a board just above the floor that I could stand on and unroll the paper in 5-foot sections. It was 3 feet wide and 5-foot sections, and in total 60 feet long. So that allowed me to work section by section. But as a result, as I worked on one part, I wouldn't see the part that I'd already rolled up. It was gone. So I also made, as you can see there, a tiny little maquette. And I imagined this thing like scrolling down to the floor, but that didn't really work out. So it was just like entirely too long for the space. But Craig nicely came up with the solution of unfolding it over time. So it changed in the duration of the exhibition. But you can see here, there's Chubby Cat always doing her part. I was able to look at the whole thing at one point, each of the scrolls by taking them outside and on a big tarp, unrolling them, and we took some photos and things like that. But it almost felt surprising, like, wow, I forgot about that part of the scroll because I had to roll it up and I didn't really have an opportunity in the studio, or it wasn't effective to unroll it as I worked. So day after day, I would forget what came before. By working from above, it really worked out. Like I'm glad I made that decision. The Salmon Art Gallery piece I had made in oil and Conte, and I put the butcher paper in sections on the wall. We have tall ceilings, so that helped. But it didn't, it really like ended up making it so I had to think about things not dripping because I didn't want them to drip, or if it started to drip, it would just get out of control. But working from above and with ink on transfer paper, largely with other materials then too, I was able to do things that became really exciting, like pulling the ink up and the paper would crackle and end up with these ridges. I could drag it around. I could at times lift up the paper and let the ink just like flow down. Sometimes I put it too close to the end of the roll, and it did that on its own, and just rolled down into the roll. And that was always kind of fun and exciting as well. So I made these actually short videos laying down in the cube. Um, I'll play them, and you can get a sense of the whole thing as it was at this point. Okay, and here's the second one. And with this, you get the added benefit of my finger looking like a little puppet on the bottom. So I'll just get into more of the specifics of media choices and things like that, and think about this idea of aesthetics of text, because it was something that really emerged for me as I worked. Um, when working on the scroll over many days, as I mentioned, I just really started to choose media and color for their differing moods in relation to what people wrote, at times in relation to things that were happening in Kamloops. So my choice of the red orange that dominated part of the work was in reference to the Kamloops residential school. So I chose those media for these differing moods, particularly though from people's letters, as I was influenced from those. But what I really enjoyed was how there was sometimes a flowing together of media and sometimes a contrasting of them. So, for example, a waxy um, oil stick together with a more fluid media like varnish or ink, they would contrast and create surprising results on that transfer paper. In this one is a close-up of those dripping lines from part of that I showed earlier. But these differing tools, they really called for different approaches. So I thought about how, with a large graphite stick, I could make these looping lines really large and really they'd expand out across the the scroll. And yet when I used, a small pencil, I had to get close and work really tight in on the piece. And both of those then require a different read if you can read it. I mean, the one becomes a more intimate read and the other a more distance read. This kind of messiness, though, where there are words in it, really starts to like interplay between legibility and illegibility, something I was very interested in as I made this piece. So I often, as I worked, also held up the paper to the window to consider how light would affect the read of the work and the color and the material. And this was, of course, with the intention of potentially having it backlit. Um, and the gallery ended up doing that. So you can see in these install shots that the pieces are backlit and end up looking different than seeing it on a flat surface like I was working on. One tool that I really started to enjoy was a house painting brush that I could load up with ink. And one thing that happened was that as I'd write with it, I didn't tend to use cursive, but block letters with that. I realized how the writing ended up forming these shapes and molding other parts of writing into shapes. So they became very much a design as opposed to a meaning of the word. And they sculpted parts of the piece in positive and negative spaces. So as I work, I really started to think about the question of, what is text? Like, what is writing? It's really just molding space with tools like ink or graphite, a kind of beautiful way of shaping a white page into circles and ovals, much like drawing. Except with writing, we have this higher expectation of intelligibility and drawing a more open read. So I guess I was starting to play between those two spaces. So as the words became difficult to read, as with a script, and by script I don't mean like one you'd read if you're in a play, but a script I mean like the Roman alphabet or a script that is different than the Roman alphabet. Um, like so it became very much like a script in a language foreign to me. So I hope the qualities of line and more of those things kind of emerge because there is not that intelligibility like when looking at writing in another language in another script. So in that way, those material qualities might be able to connect more viscerally and a new meaning, a more open meaning might emerge in the abstraction. I've always been interested in artists who work with this interplay and writers as well between legibility and illegibility or that make people work to read something because I think the working to read it and maybe the inability to read it might be part of the meaning of the work. So one example is Glenn Ligon, the American artist. He uses in some of his work these metal stencils of letters and he pushes through oil stick increasingly thick so that the words like go from white to black and you can't after a while read what they say, but you can attempt to read. Also, and again, I think that's very important to the work. Another person I've always been interested in is Canadian poet B.P. Nichol and other concrete poets who don't work in that same way as artists. Their letters are very clear, their words are very clear, but they form them into shapes, and you wonder what is the shape about. And it also makes it a different kind of read. And then there's this interplay between visual art and the word. So I was likely influenced by these sources and others as I continued to write on the scroll. the words increasingly again became a pattern or a series of patterns in larger shapes rather than discrete words for me. As I worked, I also thought about Craig's mention of the palimpsest. He talked to me about that earlier on in the year, because I found a process of writing clearly, then obscuring or cover over began to take hold at certain parts of the scroll. So words covered words, ink blotted out words. Sometimes I use white shellac to write with, which covered over other words. So overall, I think that are ideas are all present, like the experiences of all the letter writers are all there. I pretty much wrote everything everyone wrote to me on these scrolls, but some of them are only in a sense as memories or visual trails or intermingling voices and layering of many experiences who contributed their, people who contributed their stories to this project, who all of whom I'm so appreciative and I'm so thankful they were willing to share with me so that their stories could be the basis of this work. Here, to begin to close, I return to the whole "How have you been" installation installed in the gallery. And the work is intended for, installation to flow overhead. If you remember, I talked about that in the beginning. I really had this idea about wanting to create a warm and inviting space. So how the work appears in the gallery, and how people move with it or their experience of it was important to me. So I asked the gallery to paint the walls those really dark gray, chalky on the two sides, and that turned out wonderfully and sort of funnels people in from two doorways. And then there are the two scrolls that Craig and his team hung beautifully and sometimes forwarded so that it would change somewhat. And then they're backlit so that hopefully they mold the space and achieve that goal. So the work overall is a letter in reply, not only to those who contributed to my project, but to the community at large and beyond. So how have you been? I hope all of you are well as we continue to experience this period of pandemic and of course, many other things so important in our lives and considerations, both in Kamloops, Canada and beyond. So that's my talk for there. And now we'll move on to questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. That was amazing.
Thank you.
I think I'll start with, there's a couple questions, one on the chat and one on our Q&A board. The question from our chat, I believe, was submitted earlier. And it reads from Maria Coates. Can you please explain what is human and material gesture entails? Can you please explain what human and material gesture entails?
Yeah, I think that's maybe from is that from my bio or my artist statement? I straddle these two worlds, the one in teaching and communications at Okanagan College and having a linguistics background. And in those areas, researching nonverbal communication, so much of what I read and the people I talk to, we're all talking when we say nonverbal communication and gesture, it's about the body and how the hands move or how the body moves in space. But then I add material gesture because I feel like that brings me, the visual arts into that topic as well. That there's not only the body in space and the hand in space, but maybe the hand with a media or the way objects in space look and seem to gesture. Maybe they don't move, but there are different materials on those objects that seem to have a different kind of gesture than another type of object, quite like a human gesture. And so I'm trying to bring kind of like bridge these two areas and bring some broaden that point. I hope that answers your question. If not, you can ask more.
Um, Also, and in our Q&A, Chero Neville, Camel's Art Gallery curator, the choice of the scroll made me think of ancient ways of communicating. Did this end up folding into your thinking at all?
Yeah, when I was younger, I had this really grand opportunity of an internship at Minneapolis Institute of the Arts, and I worked in the ancient galleries, and I did a lot of actually archiving and of digital files because what we were doing was creating what was really novel at the time, these touchscreen computer programs for the galleries, especially the historic galleries. And they have a large body of ancient Chinese scrolls, particularly, and some Japanese. And so definitely I thought about that. And when I mentioned about, looking at a script from a language foreign to me, not like, for example, some of the Chinese or Japanese scripts, I see them then as beautiful lines on paper, and so that I saw in those works, and then also stories that unfolded across a scroll. I think one thing that I thought about was, would mine be like a story that unfolds across a scroll? And in that way, maybe not as much. Temporarily, I think the things are happening sort of all at the same time, even though I made them over time. So definitely, I think there's a similarity and influence there. Thanks for that question, Charo.
Uh, yeah, that's great. Just in with that scroll idea, and you were talking about the different material and different inks and things, and they'd make a different kind of sensory experience or physical experience of dripping or crackling or all this thing. When we shifted the scroll over, when we rolled it down to expose more of it, it is very much that experience. I think it was me, Matt Tremblay, our preparator, and Garnet, install assistant, or Christina, and it's two of us on ladders, and the other going over each bar very carefully, rolling it up off the floor over the next one. So it's quite a process. And this whole time the paper's crackling, and every once in a while some piece of black is, oh, it's cracked. No tears, but cracked ink
Yeah,
and just a different ground. It was quite the, it was like I guess an element us in the gallery and on the install crew get to experience in a slightly
yeah,
different
that's
way.
great. I sort of I thought, are they going to end up ripping it? And I was in a way looking forward to having to come there with the spray glue and fix it. I ripped it once because I had that ingenious idea of having the rolls on each side of this board. But then at one point the roll went under the board and I didn't realize that, and I pulled it back and it ripped. But then it like sent me onto this new avenue of investigating methods for gluing it and gluing it well. And I wanted to make it look like I didn't glue it, but then in all my test pieces for gluing, because I didn't want to go like right in with the piece and glue it. The test pieces for gluing I now have on my studio wall because they're really cool combinations of different materials that I was testing out glues on. And I thought, I kind of like that. Like if I had done this by accident early on, I might have ended up using it as part of the method in the work, like
Right.
spontaneous change.
We were
No,
being
Craig.
too careful.
Yeah, maybe. Well, you don't need to rip it now that you've been begging, so thank you.
We still
I
have the
see.
install.
That's right. I see some questions here in the chat. One from Michelle
Yeah,
Beggy, who I work with at Okanagan College. Thanks for joining, Michelle. I don't know if you want to read that off, Craig, maybe? Can
yeah.
you see it?
Wonderful talk, Amy. There is the words and the visual art. How does the layering of words and images become another, maybe more powerful thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I wish we could just have a chat, Michelle, about that because I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Um, if there were, I feel like the words are the images in this? So maybe if there were words with what I thought of as a separate image, then that would make a gap where you'd wonder the relationship of the word in the image. But now, like, I just want to know what you think about the words being the image. Can it potentially being a more powerful thing? Um, yeah, I'm not sure. Like, I feel like the powerfulness of an experience or the work is really in the audience's hands. So I'm sorry that in a way I'm not able to fill in that question fully, but thanks so much for it.
When we were, so for everybody that doesn't know, the Kamloops Art Gallery, we received all the letters. We didn't read them, but we received all the letters for you and then forwarded them on. And some were postcards, and it might have been the late submission. It was definitely the later submissions. A few came in more drawing. You showed the one with the code, but one
Yeah.
was a ready-made assisted drawing, and another, if I remember correctly, was some kind of image or drawing rather than words.
Yeah, that's right. Jason McLean submitted a piece of mail art that was words and mainly image, so word on image, and it did make me wonder, like I'm talking about, what is the words suddenly take on a new broader meaning because there's this image that seems unrelated to the words there. But you're right, there was a stack of submissions from Salmon Arm secondary art students, and those were all drawings. There was some other mail art that I didn't know who it was from.
Yeah, I think I got that one. I don't recall.
Yeah.
Just that relationship with image and word, like I do, you can read these words or read an image. Perhaps sometimes the words become kind of caption when they're associated with an image. Or I think of, you mentioned your practice of going into the studio and writing gobbledygook. It makes me
Yeah.
think of surrealist automatic drawing, automatic writing for that matter, and putting those things down. And then in some cases seeing, I believe it's Max Ernst works that are collage with kind of a story written below, but they're very unrelated. You can't,
Yeah.
they don't apply. I don't know if that's more powerful or less powerful either.
Yeah.
But
I
if you
don't know.
think of
It's
that.
like in communications classes, I've often played some semiotics games with students, and one of them is I give them all these photocopied cards with a cut image on them. They're often from old magazines or books, maybe like a guy with a globe or a tool. And then I have everyone put on a sticky note of like a 2 to 4 word description of the thing on the card. And then they lay them all out and then they can have at it. And they're supposed to switch the sticky notes to different cards. And it's really funny because initially the words make sense and they're like a caption or a description of what is on the card. And then suddenly they become like confusingly unrelated to what is on the other card. But then it's like, wow, whoa, big new idea here. Because of this disconnect makes a space for a new idea. I just love that game.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. We have another question up here from Margaret Krumka, our director at the Kamloops Art Gallery. Uh, well, I apologize for being late to the talk. So if you shared, please ignore. Before this exhibition, I knew your work as being more publicly performative. How is it that you moved from that way of working to this way?
Oh, you mean the performance projects? Well, I had always been involved in drawing and painting when I was young and in my 20s, but I, after school, didn't really see that as an avenue for, um, yeah, well, like I came from a world of you got to get a job. And so that is, it just didn't really see it as an avenue for employment. but that wasn't part of the world I was in. So when I moved to Vancouver, I had that fortunate experience of working at Emily Carr in the 2000s, and created that Janet performance project with two colleagues, and that was a lot of fun. But um, I was still painting a lot, and really because I met Harold Nix, my partner, I started to paint in oil and really explore that more and work in collage because I just was interested in both those things, but they were really a side practice. And then I went to grad school a bit late again at UBCO, and there I was working in printmaking. And my goal with printmaking was to take what is my interest in drawing and make serial projects, things where drawings start and they change and they become a little bit different through the means of screen printing. And but it's hard to have access to a print studio, and I like to work every day. So I have always continued drawing every day a little bit, and when I can, painting. So yeah, I've been working in those media all along. But you might be thinking about the Amcor project where Corinne and I would interrogate people while drawing them, which is which is a
Yeah,
blast.
you
Yeah.
know, I think we talked about this, but
Uh-huh.
the first project I remember encountering was it was either at the alternator or in that building, and seeing language, and you could
Oh
book
yeah.
a studio time or something. And I wasn't sure exactly what it was, but I had missed you. I had come to
Oh yeah.
Kelowna, and the day you were away or something.
That's right. Well, there was a conference at UBCO and they let me be a part of it and have the Studio 111. And, I'm always working at Okanagan College, so I don't always have a lot of time to do something um, too full on, but it happened to be at the end of the semester. So I spent almost every day there when I wasn't at the conference in an almost empty studio drawing what I could see. And it was an amazing experience of at first it's just like it's an empty space with a table and a chair in it. And then over time I would draw like the corner of a pipe going into the wall and then the edge of, the light socket. And it just the way things, like maybe the light hitting the floor at a particular time of day or the way a shadow hit something. And I did that for a week and I called it seeing language. It was like the language of the space, is what I thought. And each of them was like a little icon. Before that, I had done these little icons for Capsula magazine and wrote a paper about how people interpret space, especially empty space, whereas there's a lot happening in empty space. And this was like way before social distancing, but with the idea, like if you're standing next to someone, you don't necessarily, I always in linguistics class have people make a word for the space between themselves and the student next to them, or basically the space between two chairs, because it's not labeled. And so then, with that idea of if something has a label, we tend to give it more attention in a language. If it's not, if you give it a label, then it can, and it fill that up with meaning that people talk about. Well, now we've got that going on. The space between self and other has a lot of meaning, how much space you give there. Anyway, so I took these little icons of spaces between things, and then that's where the Seeing Language project went to, like little icons that are language of a particular larger space. It makes me laugh when I talk about it, but I really enjoyed that project.
Well,
Yeah.
now kind of getting a little more insight, they make a lot more sense to me. I mean, I see it. I see it a lot more now.
Yeah, that's great. I feel like I jump around a lot, always searching for these ideas of language in art. They're there for me. They all come together, but I I find them sometimes hard to articulate.
Oh, Yeah, me too. um, one of the when you talked about especially through the pandemic and well, still just dealing with so much digital printing, like I imagine papers and things you deal with through teaching and correspondence and email and just constantly the typed on the screen, and the difference between moving to cursive and seeing whatever it is, personality or what have you. I on social media, I imagine somewhere recently, I've seen the phrase, I'm paraphrasing, go put a real pen to paper and watch shit get real, as opposed to, I think it was I don't, I wouldn't even know
Pretty
where to
good.
find it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it seems to speak to this kind of blather and stuff you can say on social media and be ignorant or whatever it is, and then actually throwing that thing down on paper. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, no, that's a, when you think about it, we're especially with this past year, I mean, communication and its speed with which it happens and the expectation of how fast someone gets back to you. And, your message always has this audience, whether it's out to a large audience or an email to one person. And when you go back to pen on paper, you're either, your own audience, and you're not, it's kind of hard almost to release that idea of audience, or making a work like this, then it's like the long time before there's an audience and I may or may not hear back from them. It's a great difference, but it's it's helpful for the mind. Like, I gotta say, I think I did good last year, but I ended the year pretty frazzled, and just working for long hours on paper, whether it would have been for an audience or not, was sure helpful.
Oh well, I'm glad you managed to get this to do the project here. I
Yeah,
feel
I'm glad too.
similarly about the last couple of years. On our chat, sorry, I don't see who put it out there. There is a link to Erica Badu's Twitter, the
Oh, is that the?
soul singer, I suppose you'd call it, and that quote comes from her, seemingly comes from her.
Oh, that's good to have the
Uh,
reference.
yeah. Um,
I like the
I just
repetition
had
of
one
real.
further thought on that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Was just when like Council Art Gallery did drink and draw a while back, and go to the local brew pub and spread out a big roll of paper and invite people to have a drink, hoping that a beer or two or whatever would loosen people up enough. And I do see that hesitancy and fear of putting pencil to paper. If
Yeah,
you just are trying to rope somebody in, it's like, oh no, I can't draw. Or you can write, make a mark, do something. And for some, I mean, it's a certain setting. It just seems like a hard thing for a lot of people to do.
I think it was Krashen, and Krashen might be Canadian. He's a linguist. I can't remember exactly. This is returning to grad school. I think it's him who ran a series of studies on dropping what's called affect filter. So when you have your affect filter up, it's like you have all these nerves, or they call it like cortisone or stress or something like that, and that sort of impedes like free thinking, free flow of ideas. And he would study a free ability to speak in another language. So they ran these studies and wrote a lot of academic papers of what drinking can do to lower affect filter and enable people to speak more fluently in a foreign language that they're learning. So
Oh,
I see your drink and draw as the potential for just like that. It's like the lowering of the affect filter and the freeing up of the
okay.
hand, like communicating in another language, which drawing is like, has the same kind of nervous reaction for people.
Yeah,
I
well, we'll
love
get
it.
back on. or I will, or someone will, as soon as we
Well,
can get arm's length of each other.
sometime when we can get back
Uh,
together, right?
yeah, yeah. I think we've got one more comment.
Ilsa, hi Ilsa.
I so love your comments around writing, the physical act, type on paper and digital text, and the hand being erased through the process.
Ah, thank you. Thank you so much. I know Ilsa from Banff, but she's an artist living in North Vancouver.
Okay, great. Yeah, we've found a lot of these Zoom talks. It's a way that people can reconnect a little bit.
Yeah, that's really great. I was hoping this was a good hour, but maybe not for everybody. And Emily said that it's recorded and can be online. So living into perpetuity,
Yeah.
which makes me both nervous and excited.
Oh, one more question. What do you find was the most gratifying of the process?
Oh, the most gratifying. You know, I think it was that I had that roll of 60 feet, and actually, two of them, and it was just standing up on it and working and not being precious about a space because I had like so many feet that I was like driven to do. So it was just working and continuing to work and trying things out and playing. um, it really was like amazing how many things I could discover by doing that. It kind of took me back to being an undergrad or the time I taught drawing at UBCO, where you get students to, like just have a bunch of newsprint and do a bunch of gestural drawings or quickly draw people or quickly draw a thing because it really loosens you up and try different materials. I felt like I was doing that, but in a much more thoughtful way than I would have done when I was a student. And I just really learned a lot about new interactions and materials that I took away from it.
Oh, yeah,
So
that's great.
mhm. Yeah, thanks for your question. Oh, hey, Tulsa is from Okanagan College. Thanks for joining, Tulsa. Is that it?
Okay, I think with that, we'll wrap up.
Great.
Amy, thanks so much for doing this, and thanks to everybody who came out tonight. Came out.